Hello and welcome. My name is Mr. Ricks, Jesse Ricks. I am a psychology teacher in England, and this video is an overview of what an A-level psychology looks like in the UK. I'm going to be going through the AQA spec for psychology in the UK, as it's the most popular spec that there is. And from my knowledge, other specs aren't too much different in terms of content. They're normally a bit different in terms of structure, but and marking and assessment, but the overall content stays largely the same. So I'm going to be going through that. This video is going to be great for those that are thinking about doing a psychology A level in another year, or if you're just about to start one in September. And then this is great for you, but this video is also going to be really good for adults. Okay, one thing that they don't tell you is when you get older, you can actually look back at GCSEs and A levels for things that you missed out, you didn't know. There's some knowledge that maybe some people take for granted that you don't have, and if you just want to learn anything, you can go back and you can look at the A levels and GCSEs for those things. Okay, so let's get started then. So what is psychology? I've messed up, I've put it in the bottom left corner there. But psychology is a study of science, the study and science of human behavior. Okay, it's human behavior. It's the science. Psychology is a science. That is very important if you're choosing to do an A level. This is something that you might not realize or recognize. And within the course, which I'm going to show you in a second, there is how to set up an experiment, how to analyze results, data, all of that stuff that you get with science is in psychology. It's not like philosophy, whereby you can use the word I, you can say I think this, you can just making sure that you have good argumentation. You need that as well in your writing, but it's argumentation of facts, okay, not beliefs, thought, or anything like that. I normally sell psychology as it's trying to explain why people act the way they act, how they are the way they are, why they do the things they do, why they think the way that they think. Okay, that's normally how I try and sell psychology, because that is ultimately some of the really big questions that we're trying to get at in psychology. Okay. Human behavior. So here are some of the topics that you'll look at in your A level. So social influence, memory, attachment, approaches, biopsychology, psychopathology, and of course research methods. If you're just starting a course or you're about to start a course in September, or you're thinking about it, some institutions, colleges, schools, they put research methods first on the list of things that you'll learn. This is the order they appear in the book. It's not the order that they're always taught. Research methods is so fundamental to everything that you learn, because within each one of those topics you will learn a lot of different studies, and you'll have to criticize those studies and understand what's bad about them, what's good about them, because there's no such thing as a perfect study. So that is something that you are going to have to gain. That's a skill you're going to get. Okay, so the order is not necessarily the order you'll be taught. So social influence, let's look at the first one. So social influence, these are the things that you'll learn. I've tried to narrow them down into two separate sections, mainly conformity and obedience. So conformity is going along with what people are doing, what people how they act. So Asher's line experiment is a very famous example of that. If you did GCSE psychology, then you may have come across that already. Definitions, there's a lot of definitions because there's different types of conformity that you'll learn about. And yeah, that's that. Zimbardo's prison experiment is also kind of conformity, de-individuation. It's an experiment you look at. You may have come across it at GCSE, but you really go into detail about everything that is involved and all the things that have happened since that experiment, which leads me nicely onto obedience and Milgram's shock experiment. So the prison experiment and the shock experiment, if you've not heard of them, are crazy experiments that happened. The 60s and the 70s were a weird time where people didn't really know how people would react or act in certain situations. And a lot of social psychology, which is what this is, came off the back of World War II And during, the Nuremberg trials, World War II, if you ask the Nazis, why did you do the things you do? Why did you commit such horrendous and horrific acts, the worst known to mankind? Many of the people said, I did it because I was told to. That was it. I did it because I was told to. And that just gave mankind many questions. So that's where the crazy experiments like the prison experiment, the shock experiment come in. I'm not going to spoil them for you, but you can find a plethora of stuff on the internet. Even Darren Brown's redone the shock experiment. You can find that on YouTube really easily. Under Milgram's shock experiment there on the screen, there's situational variables. So Milgram's shock experiment got repeated a bunch of times, and you just kind of want to know why people obey. Is there certain, situations in which people are more likely to obey? So if you're in a fancy institute, are you more likely to obey than if you was in a rundown building? Like, does location matter? The uniform that the authority figure's wearing, right? If someone tells you to do something, are you more likely to obey depending on what they're wearing? Milgram's agentic state and authority. So this comes back to his theory of why we might obey. Personality and locus of control. There you'll learn about a sociologist that thought that perhaps an authoritarian personality was something that affected whether we obey. Okay, do you have an internal or external locus of control? Do you think you have a charge? Do you think you're in charge of your life? Or not, because that might affect whether you're likely to obey. And then just on the end there, so I've got minority influence. When we look at conformity on the left hand side of the screen there, conformity is majority influence, right? It's going along with the majority. But there are situations and times in the world where minority, an individual or a small group, has made big differences. So you look at that in depth as to what kind of factors play a role into the minorities having a great influence. And on top of that, resistance to social influence. Okay, so knowing all of this stuff, how can you not fall prey to some of these factors that you learn about? Okay, social influence. Memory. I'll try and speed this up. Memory. So I was always fascinated when I was younger by memory, because when you're in GCSE A level, just education seems like a memory game. Okay, it's just remembering stuff. That's all it is, and then being able to retrieve it. So it's something worth doing to look at memory as a psychological through a psychological lens. So your first thing you learn on the left there is coding capacity and duration. So you learn about, is there a limit how much you can remember? Is there a certain length of time in which you can remember things before they go? It brings you on to long-term memory. Are there different types of memories that you hold? And forgetting. So can you forget memories? Which of course you can. We all forgotten, but there's many different ways in which you forget stuff. So the two on the screen there are interference and retrieval failure. So interference is an example. You forget something because another similar piece of information gets in the way. Okay, that would be a type of forgetting, interference. Moving on, models in the middle. So the multi-store model of memory might be something that you've looked at if you've done GCSE psychology. This model is a very simplistic way of going from the information in which you take in from your surroundings, all the information in the world, every little thing that you hear, you see, you smell. Do you remember all of that stuff? No. Well, what's the process it goes to get something from your senses all the way through, paying attention to it, short-term memory, rehearsing it, getting it all the way to your long-term memory? What does that structure look like? How do you get something to your long-term memory? The next model is working memory model. This is very high-level stuff, but you largely A level, you just need to be able to recall what the working memory model is. But the most fantastic, crazy, quick stuff that you could do with your mind is just insane. So the working memory model is your short-term memory. It's your working memory when you've got to do something. What does that look like? What are all the components of that? And then the most fascinating things for me on the end there are eyewitness testimony. You have misleading information. You do a study, car crash study, Loftus and Palmer, you know, and you learn about how people's memories are not great, right? They're reconstructive. It's not just binary. You don't just remember something or you don't. It's not like that. Your memory is very complicated and it can be changed so easily even without you knowing. Okay, you think you remember completely accurately, but you don't. And then the effects of anxiety. So if you're an eyewitness to a crime, if that crime is a more anxiety-provoking crime, um, does that affect your memory recall when you're saying what happened? Did you see the guy? Can you point to the guy that did the crime in a lineup? Is your memory going to be affected by anxiety in these situations? Okay. And lastly on there is the cognitive interview. So the cognitive interview is a method that can be taught to law enforcement and specific individuals to help the recall of eyewitnesses to be as accurate as possible. Okay, because as I've just said, memory has got so many problems, it's insane, and sometimes they can recall things and they think, yeah, definitely, that's the person that did this crime, when really they're wrong. Okay, the amount of times that happens is just ludicrous. So the cognitive interview is a method, a way in which trying to extract information from an eyewitness to be as accurate as possible and understanding which bits aren't true. So next, attachment. Jumping over from the cognitive aspect of psychology, attachment is more developmental psychology. So some explanations here. So we've got learning theory, so conditioning. This is the first time you look at conditioning, but you look at it quite a lot throughout the whole thing. Conditioning is where you associate one thing with another, and obviously babies and animals do this extremely well. They associate two things together. Bowlby's monotropic theory. So how important is a caregiver? What big psychological impact do they have on people's lives? And you learn about John Bowlby and his work from the 1940s. Again, with his theory of maternal deprivation. On the flip side, what happens if there isn't a caregiver for a child? What happens if they're not looked after as well as they should have been, if they've not been given attention, if all the things that you need to be a good caregiver and to maximize the child's development, what happens if that is lacking, if you're deprived of that? Types of attachment as well. As a child grows, there's different attachment styles that you'll learn about. Mary Ainsworth's strange situation there, if you've heard of that. There's different attachment styles that children develop as they're young. And it's just going through what those are. And then on the other side, there's just so much content in attachment that I just categorized it as other. But caregiver infinite interaction, so what should they look like? Schaefer's stages of attachment, so as a child grows and a baby grows, what does the attachment look like? When do they become attached? What does that look like at these different stages? Role of the father is included. You've got to learn about that because historically a caregiver, Bowlby, this was the case back when Bowlby was doing his work as well, and Ainsworth, the caregiver was primarily a woman for cultural reasons, social reasons, as well as biological reasons. So where does that leave the role of the father? Is it important with modern research? What if a child has two fathers? How does that affect its development, if it does at all? Animal studies. How do animals develop attachments? Because animals do get attached. You've got pets, cultural differences between attachments. The influence of early attachments. How they influence who you become and who you are in later life. You cover that. And then the last one is the Romanian orphans. There was a time in the 90s, due to the political regime in Romania at the time, that there just so happened to be a lot of orphans. You go into details in the course about this, and they weren't looked after. They didn't have any caregivers. It was a horrendous situation. You just type into your YouTube Romanian orphans, you'll find so much stuff. So that leads us to look into those Romanian orphans that are obviously still around today, and how that affected their development, not having parental figures and caregivers. Okay, biopsych, everyone's favorite. As I said at the start, psychology is a science. So you're going to have to do biopsych. You're going to have to do the biological part of the things we look at in psychology. So I've tried to boil them down as quick as possible. Biopsych is such a big topic that you do it in year 12 and 13 typically. It's split between the books, just down there on the floor. It's split between the year 12 and the year 13 because it's so big. It's the same with research methods. That's split as well because the topics are just so important to psychology. So let's start with the systems in the middle there. The nervous system you might have done in GCSE if you did GCSE psychology, peripheral nervous system, central nervous system, that kind of stuff. Endocrine system, so that's a fight or flight type stuff. You learn all about that. Going up back to investigating, so you do brain scans. You need to know all the types of ways in which we can investigate the brain, and you do a piece of research there. You look at the split brain research that was done, where people had their corpus callosum cut, which is a bundle of nerves that connects the two sides of the brain. And what happens when when that bundle of nerves gets cut? What happens when your two sides of your brain doesn't communicate with each other? Which is linked with localization on the right-hand side of the screen there. Localization means that the certain parts of the brain do certain things. Okay, each part of the brain has their kind of role, their function. What happens when those functions can't talk to each other? Okay. On top of that, you need to know all of the biological stuff. So it says structure and function of neurons. So remember in class where you used to draw cells, that kind of stuff. Neurons are very specialized cells in the brain. They do certain stuff, and you need to know what they look like, the different types of cells, and what they do, the different parts. Neurotransmitters is a fancy word for chemicals. You'll learn about some chemicals in the brain. You've probably already heard a bunch of chemicals from pop culture, like serotonin, oxytocin, okay, dopamine. Transmission of neurotransmitters. I know all these words sound really scary, but they're not as scary as they seem. It's a benefit of learning psychology is you get all these fancy words in your arsenal, all right, that you get to use to impress your friends. But transmission of neurotransmitters, so literally how those chemicals move across the brain, how they connect from one neuron to another. Okay, that's all that means. Localization I've talked about. There's certain areas of the brain doing certain things. Plasticity and recovery. So the brain actually is changing all the time. It's changing what it does and how it works. And if you become suddenly, let's take an example, if you suddenly become disabled and you can't walk anymore, and then you go to a rehab and you try and relearn how to walk, right? Fantastic thing. Your brain can do that. That is that recovery, that plasticity. Your brain is relearning how to do these certain motor functions because they've been lost. Okay, that's a fantastic example in a real life application of how we can use psychology to help with people with their issues. Okay, so that's one thing. And then the last one is circadian, infradian, and ultradian rhythms. So it's just all about sleep cycles and the biological mechanisms that involve sleep. What do we take in from the environment to help us understand when to sleep, and what chemicals are released at certain times, which part of the brains are involved. Are there any hormonal factors that play a role in sleep and regulating, internal regulation of our body clock? Okay, so that's all that stuff. Again, that's split across the 2 years. You don't have to learn that all at once. This next one, approaches. This is essentially a history of psychology. That's what this is. Approaches is kind of a history of psychology. Throughout history, people have taken a different approach to answer some big questions about why humans do what they do, how they act the way they act. So starting off with a biological approach, simply says that all things psychological are biological, which is true. But biological approach strictly looks at problems through psychological things through a biological lens. Okay, so if you have depression, the biological approach would say that this is an imbalance with serotonin, for example. Okay, this is chemical imbalance. Therefore, the treatment would be a biological treatment. It would be drugs. You take some SSRIs. You take some selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, take some drugs, and that will sort you out. That's what the biological approach would say. Okay, and it's not the same for the rest of these approaches. And the great thing about these is not only is it a history of psychology, very short because this is a short module, but this is also the different types of ways in which you can, if you were a professional in the field of psychology, you can pick and take from these approaches to help the individual that's in front of you, and what's useful. So for some people, drugs might be the best approach. For some people, it may be something else. So psychodynamic approach, that's talking about Freud. I won't talk too much about Freud. If you don't know him, you will soon. But yeah, all the lovely things he had to say about personality and the way someone develops and how they grow. Humanistic approach focused on the individual. Okay, so you'll learn about the humanistic approach, the individual that's sat in front of you. As again, the biological approach is just looking at people overall. How does their biology work? People's biology. Humanistic approach is, look, if we sit down with someone in therapy, that's the person in front of us, right? We take a very human approach. We look at that individual and we try and sort out what's best for them. Around about the same time, the behaviorists came around, and huge. So we learned about conditioning, so operant and classical conditioning. You might have heard about that in pop culture. Again, it gets referenced quite a lot, and that's the behaviorists. Social learning theory is very similar, and then lastly there is the cognitive approach. So later on, so 60s, 70s, we had the cognitive approach, which kind of looked at humans as a computer, right? So we have a system, we have mechanisms, right? That's what the brain is a symbolic computer, and we just need to know how that organ, how that system works, okay, and looking at it like that. But off the back of the cognitive approach, looking at how people think and why they think that way, came CBT as a therapy, for example. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a cognitive approach therapy. So you can take the biological approach and the cognitive approach. You can give someone medication as well as taking them to a talk therapy, offering them that to talk about CBT. Okay. Psychopathology. This one always gets people because they think, oh, psychopathology, do we learn about psychopaths? The answer is no, unfortunately. Psychopathology, you learn 3 things. So you learn phobias, OCD, and depression. So let's just put that up. You learn, for all of them, you learn about their characteristics, behavioral, emotional, and cognitive characteristics of all 3 of those. So how someone with a phobia is going to behave, what their emotions, and what they're going to be thinking. Same with depression. How does someone with depression behave? What are their emotions? How do they think? This links in very well with diagnoses. Okay, so you learn about the DSM, the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual. It's a book that professionals ought to be using, or as one of them, to diagnose sufferers from mental illnesses. And it has in there all the kind of things, all the symptoms that you need to be able to make a diagnosis. And so again, a lot of them is those behavioral, emotional, cognitive characteristics of all 3 of those. The explanations and treatments, as it says at the bottom of there, you need to know that. Like, so why do some people get phobias? Why do some people get depressed? Some people not? That kind of thing. And then how do we treat them? And we use those approaches to do that. So, so that behaviorist approach, doing conditioning, connecting one thing with another. So for phobias, how does that explain why someone might obtain a phobia? Do they connect a negative experience with an emotion or with something, right? Is that how that works? That's how you look at it. And same with treatment. So the treatments for phobias might be very different to the treatment for depression. And again, we use those approaches to help us look at treatments, like I've just said previously. Very quickly at the top there, it says definitions of abnormality. So when you're looking at diagnoses, right, when you're looking at diagnosing someone, let's backstep. Before you diagnose someone, we look at humans from the very start. Let's imagine you're just looking at humans overall, right? And you need to know what's a disorder, what's not, right? You're looking at someone and you're seeing their behavior. How do you know there's something wrong with them? Okay, you're looking at their behavior. You ask them, how they feel, what they're thinking. Okay, how do you know it's a disorder? How do you know it's a problem? Well, that's where we come to this definition of abnormality. So in the course, there's four definitions of abnormality that you look at and you analyze. Why are they good definitions or bad definitions? Okay, because when you look at the diagnostic criteria to be able to diagnose someone with depression, well, that criteria is based on definitions of abnormality and what's disorderly. Okay, as strict definitions. Okay. Research methods is the next one. So research methods happens. It's something you just got to do. People hate it, but you've got to do it. It's a science. Psychology is a science. So these are some of the things we look at. Okay, again, it's over the 2 years. Very thorough. Research methods. So you look at hypotheses. You look at how do you start an experiment, experimental designs. How do you set one up? What do you do with samples? How do you get a sample? What do you do with them? Types of experiment. Ethical issues. Every psychological study does have ethical issues. If you're working with human beings, there's going to be some ethical issue there. So even if it's just gaining consent or something like that. Observations, interviews, self-report. They're all different to to experiments, right? You can observe someone's behavior. You can ask them about their behavior. Okay, so that's interviews, self-report, questionnaires. And then this is the stuff that, in my experience, students dislike. It's the correlations, probability of significance, statistical tests, all the mathematical stuff. I've put an example of some statistical tests that you do there. So chi-squared, sine test, t-test. Don't worry, the only one you'll have to work out is the sine test, and that's the easiest. The other tests, you don't need to be able to work them out. You just need to, for A level, you just need to be able to decide when to use which one. Okay, so you learn all about that. So you've done your experiment, you've wrapped it all together, you've got some data, numbers don't really mean anything. If I gave you an IQ test and I said, oh, your IQ is 83, right? You're going to be like, 83 what? I'm going to be like, 83 IQ points? And you're going to be like, what does that mean, right? So numbers alone don't mean anything. When you've collected your data, you have to do something with it. That's the statistical test. That's looking at the probability of that being significant or not. And then the last two on there, so let's do writing a report. So after you've after you've gone through all of those things, how to begin an experiment, gain your sample, ethical issues that you're going to overcome, how you optimize your experiment for what you're doing, how you're going to do all the mathematical side and statistical side. Writing a report, you don't have to know it, you just have to know the sections of a report. It's kind of normally rushed at the end of a research methods topic. You just need to know the sections of a report because you can be asked a 12-mark question on an exam of like a writing part of a section, okay? So you just need to know the structure of a research report. And then at the bottom there, you've got features of science as well, which is a way of saying philosophy of science. As I have a philosophical background, kind of irks me a little bit. But features of science. So you learn about Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn, philosophers of science, and their ideas, and what makes a science, essentially. And there's some terminology, some words in there that you're going to need to learn. Okay. Whew, now, almost at the end. So on top of all of that, in an A level, you will have 3 additional topics. On top of all of those topics I've just said, you will get 3 additional topics. Now, that's up for your school or your college to decide what those topics are. The 2 schools I've worked at that use this spec in particular chose the same 3 topics. They chose relationships from category 1. So you'll only do one of those 3. Schizophrenia from category 2. And then aggression from category 3. So the schools I've worked at did relationships, schizophrenia, and aggression. So I'll make future videos on those. I have known people to do stress and gender, and I know one school that did forensic psychology. In my experience, schools typically stray away from things like eating behavior and addiction. The times we live in, you understand, teachers want to be as less controversial as possible and don't want to be triggering, so teaching those becomes really hard in this day and age, even though it's psychology. So don't go in, don't see these and think, oh great, these are amazing topics, let's look at these, I want to learn about forensic psychology and addiction. The chances are you're probably not, and you're definitely not going to do both, right? You get one from each and your school has already decided that. Okay, so that's what these are. Okay, let's wrap this up then. So in summary, which again I've hidden behind my lovely face, psychology is a science. That is a crucial thing that I know a lot of people don't know. You probably won't be learning criminal psychology. So forensic psychology at the end there, it would just be one module that you do if you do it at the end of year 13. So if you're going into psychology thinking you want to do about criminals, that's fine. A lot of this stuff can be related to criminal behavior, attachment styles, therapies, treatments, all of that is useful in the actual workplace. But forensic psychology there does look at the things that you've probably heard about on Criminal Minds, where you talk about personality and geographic profiling and that kind of stuff. But don't get too excited. Don't think psychology is all criminals, murderers, all that kind of stuff. Okay? Psychology is a science, though. Last thing I'm going to say, A-levels are fucking difficult. Can I swear? I don't know. A-levels are extremely difficult. God damn, they're difficult. There's no easy A-level, okay? I have personal experience of when I was in college that people way smarter than me dropped out of A-levels, and it's still to this day I remember thinking and feeling like, how crazy is that? Why have they done that? That's insane. Because they're not easy. So my advice is, if you're choosing A-levels, if that's you at this point in time, you're choosing what you want to do, or you're in the middle of it, my advice is to choose A-levels that you're interested in. Don't choose A-levels you think will be easy. There's no such thing as an easy A-level. Okay, even topics you think, oh, they'll be easy. No. Choose topics that you're fascinated by, that you're interested in, that you kind of lean towards, the ones that you feel. You've got to pay attention to that. If you feel you're kind of leaning towards it, and then look into it a little bit, see what it is. Watching this video, maybe you've already started going on that journey, started trying to feel out what is interesting for you. Don't do things that you think will yield the best job, because trust me, by the time you're out and you're in the workplace, there will be so many jobs available that, no, just don't do that. Just don't do that. And then on top of that, don't do what your parents also want you to do, think you should do. Hopefully in this day and age, that's probably not controversial advice. Do you choose ones that you're interested in, because again, they're difficult. So in my experience, the students that made the most progress, regardless of their starting point, the ones that made the most progress are the ones that were interested in the subject, because you've got to sit down and you've got to put the work in, no matter what subject you're taking. Right? You have to find yourself YouTubing things and looking at things and reading extra and sitting down with a textbook. You've got to do that. It's really hard. So you've got to be interested in it at least somewhat. Okay, it doesn't have to be the passion of your life, but you've got to be interested enough to just want to find out that little bit more, because they're the people that do well, in my experience. As young as I am, that's my experience. So that's my advice. Okay, hopefully I've given you a bit of a flavor of what psychology is, and what could be on courses if that's something you're thinking about. If there's got any questions, any thoughts, pop them in the comment section. But other than that, thank you very much for watching.